Welcome to this explainer. You know, it's really easy to look back at the Middle Ages and see the Black Death as just this horrific tragedy that swept across continents and left nothing but death in its wake. But if we look closer at the historical records and the genetic data, a way more complex story actually emerges. Today, we're going to see how the darkest biological catastrophe in human history didn't just end the old world, it inadvertently laid the exact groundwork for the modern one.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to track the origins and those terrifying biological mechanics of the disease, witness the ground-level horror in the resulting crisis of faith, and finally, we'll examine the massive socio-economic upheaval that scattered the seeds of the Renaissance.
Let's start right at the beginning with the origins, looking at the initial arrival of the Second Plague pandemic into pre-industrial Europe.
Recent genomic analysis of historical Yersinia pestis strains reveals something super interesting. The bacterium didn't just appear out of thin air. Entering through Eastern Europe in the 14th century, it literally hitched a ride on the very trade routes that connected the expanding medieval world. By looking at DNA extracted from human remains, researchers have traced the pathogen's journey, showing how it turned the arteries of commerce into absolute superhighways of infection that would go on to devastate Europe, Asia, and North Africa for centuries.
Now, to really grasp the scale of this devastation, we first need to understand the biological reality of how this pathogen operated. Because we are dealing with a perfect, terrifying storm of ecology. The plague didn't actually start in humans. It started deep in rodent populations. And as it amplified within those animal groups, it created this massive reservoir of disease, just waiting for the exact right conditions to spill over. Here's how it builds from a local animal infection into an unstoppable pandemic. First, it circulates quietly among woodland rodents. But as those animals die off and starve, infected fleas are forced to seek new hosts, primarily city rats. Once the rats are decimated, well, those desperate fleas turn to the closest warm-blooded meal they can find, which is us. From there, human ectoparasites and human-to-human transmission completely take over, launching the full pandemic stage.
What's absolutely astonishing here is that the early plague strains completely lacked genetic diversity. Genomic data shows that during the peak of the Black Death, the Yersinia pestis bacteria was essentially a perfect clone. It was highly lethal, singular, and unyielding, literally like a biological wrecking ball. But as the centuries passed, the genome actually lost a specific region containing virulence-related genes. The pathogen adapted and mutated, mirroring the exact same evolutionary trajectory we saw hundreds of years earlier during the first plague pandemic back in the 6th century.
All right, leaving the microscopic view, let's plunge into the deeply personal, staggering human tragedy of the 14th century.
Because statistics and genomes can only tell us so much, right? To truly understand this unimaginable emotional weight, we have to listen to the survivors. Take Agnolo di Tura, a father in Siena. He wrote that he was forced to bury his 5 children with his own hands. He said so many died that everyone genuinely believed it was the end of the world. His words capture a society in complete freefall. Institutions collapsed so quickly that the basic human dignity of a traditional burial was just stripped away, leaving fathers burying their own children in mass, unblessed trenches. The trauma of witnessing everyone you know die within days made people honestly believe they were living through the biblical apocalypse.
And the sheer volume of casualties birthed this deeply macabre culture. When cemeteries overflowed, communities literally excavated old bones just to make room for the new dead, arranging them into chapels and chandeliers. Human remains became the actual architecture of everyday life. It was this constant, unavoidable visual reminder of mortality, sparking a cultural obsession with death that permeated every single aspect of medieval life going forward.
So, faced with an apparent apocalypse, medieval society naturally turned to the church for answers.
But all they found was institutional panic and silence. When the spiritual guardians of society are dying at the exact same rate as the sinners, faith itself undergoes a radical mutation. Desperate for salvation, radical groups like the Flagellants emerged, fully believing that physical penance could turn away the wrath of God. Since the traditional clergy couldn't stop the dying, the people just took matters into their own hands. You had these zealots marching from town to town, whipping themselves in public squares, hoping their self-inflicted agony would satisfy a seemingly furious God. It was a massive, direct challenge to the church's monopoly on spiritual mediation.
This institutional failure to protect the flock planted the very early seeds of religious skepticism. The church promised protection, but priests were dying just as fast as peasants. This total failure broke the illusion of institutional infallibility. Now, people didn't necessarily stop believing in God, but they for sure started questioning the human men running the church. This widespread disillusionment was the crack in the foundation that, centuries later, would widen into the Protestant Reformation.
Which brings us to the socioeconomic upheaval. Because while the human cost was catastrophic, the resulting demographic collapse triggered some massive, totally unexpected macroeconomic shifts. The sheer loss of life fundamentally altered the value of a human being's labor. The sudden shortage of workers drastically increased the bargaining power of the peasantry. Think about it. Before the plague, labor was cheap and easily exploitable. After the plague, there simply weren't enough hands to harvest crops or man the trades. Suddenly, the poorest members of society could dictate their terms, and real wages absolutely skyrocketed. If a lord wouldn't pay a living wage, a peasant could literally just walk away and find another lord who would. It was an unprecedented wealth transfer to the working class.
And we can actually track this upheaval in the agricultural data. There are these massive, wild fluctuations in English grain harvests that reflect the sheer struggle to maintain farms. Fields lay completely unharvested, returning to wilderness, simply because the workforce was either dead or had migrated to the cities for better-paying jobs. The old manorial system was breaking down in real time right before their eyes.
This forced a sudden transition from a world of rigid, feudal immobility to one where peasants and women could suddenly demand higher pay and better roles. Because labor was so incredibly scarce, the strict gender roles of the era simply had to bend. Women stepped into trades, managed estates, and took on economic roles previously denied to them. The Black Death inadvertently became an absolute engine of social mobility, shattering that stagnant feudal hierarchy and creating what was essentially a proto-middle class.
Finally, let's look at the seeds of the Renaissance. From the ashes of this medieval catastrophe arose the actual foundations of the modern world.
The trauma of the plague fundamentally changed how humanity viewed itself, its potential, and its future. As societal dynamics shifted, art mirrored the breakdown of the old medieval order. If you look at 15th century illustrations like the famous 1440 drawing of St. George killing a female dragon, you see that art shifted from purely rigid religious iconography to something way more dynamic and reflective of a changing world. The strict boundaries of medieval life had been proven fragile, and human expression began to push past those old constraints, exploring new narratives and way more complex human emotions.
This profound disillusionment with the church, combined with that newfound economic mobility we talked about, ultimately paved the way for an era of unprecedented intellectual and artistic rebirth. People had more money, they had more freedom of movement, and they had significantly less blind faith in institutional dogma. This combination created a super fertile, explosive environment for humanism, scientific inquiry, and artistic flourishing. The survivors of the plague inherited a world that was emptier, yes, but also far more malleable.
And it leaves us with a staggering realization. Would the brilliant light of the Renaissance have ever been possible without the total darkness of the Black Death? The plague was a tragedy of absolutely unfathomable proportions, yet it was exactly this destruction that cleared the path for the modern era. It forced society to adapt, to question, and to rebuild itself stronger and more dynamic than before. As you look at the world around you today, our economic systems, religious freedoms, social mobility, ask yourself how much of it was built on the ashes of the 14th century. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shaped us.